So just a few words of welcome, everybody, on this delightfully warm evening. First thing to let you know that the usual bad wine and bad company after the lecture is cancelled tonight because the students have organised instead, the Green Builders Association have organised a greenhouse ball over in Lerner Hall at 9 o'clock to which everybody's invited, in which both the wine and the company will be considerably better than usual, and they wanted to make it clear to you that you're all very, very welcome. But the main point of welcome here is just to welcome what's actually quite a large team that's been working on this Saarinen project, which has been going a long time now and is enormously important and successful. And in fact, I have up in my office always a photograph of Saarinen and one of his clients staring into a model. And what's interesting is that the client looks like an architect and Saarinen looks like a client. So the thing about Saarinen, there are so many ways in which his brilliance demands analysis but always exceeds analysis. And I think what's great about this latest rethinking of Saarinen, the Saarinen at 100 now, is that Saarinen just becomes more and more interesting. Like, it just seems that the more you uncover, the more he escapes the analysis and so on. But I think it has been quite a wonderful project and exhibition and scholarship, and it's particularly nice to welcome my colleague Dean Stern from Yale, who's played a key role in supporting this project. And it seems to me it is hopefully a project that will go another 50 years of trying to understand how this particular sort of uber interesting architect continues to be a challenge. To say the very least, he's an enormous challenge to young architects today, because they really do work that ultimately will be placed alongside of his and not necessarily look that good. And if you look in the Saarinen arsenal, he has 11, 12, 13, 14 projects, all of which generally can be placed alongside some of the most experimental work in recent years and still looks better. Now, I think there will be a moment when he will lose, but it didn't, in my opinion, it didn't happen yet. We simply don't have works of the order of TWA and the airports and so on. We don't have contemporary work of that standard. And that's before you start to speak about the architects who were, whose success is unthinkable outside of Saarinen's, the obvious case being Utzon and the Opera House competition and so on. So there's not just, let's say, the generosity and power of the work itself, but actually the extent to which Saarinen was a kind of unofficial teacher for several generations. And I think in a certain sense what you have all done with this project is return Saarinen to the role of a teacher by virtue of reminding us of the nature of the practice and the work. So that's very clear in the panels of tonight and tomorrow. For example, thinking through the question of media, I think, which is tomorrow's panel. This opens so many doors into contemporary practice. So anyway, just to say welcome. I remember the moment, I don't know if it was a year ago or something like that, when I think Elsa and Donald was saying, well, look, since we're going to do this thing at the museum, could it be possible that we would have the conference here at Columbia? And I can only say that the nicest thing about this evening is the little that I had to do with it, which is to say, not just from the point of view of my congenital laziness, but actually that it's for us a great privilege to act for a moment as a host to a part of this project. And again, I want to thank Bob and the rest of you for this amazing work. And it has been very nice to know that Reinhold, in a way, sort of has been our ambassador at the heart of this project. And at some level, Columbia was, in the chorus. But I think I really want to say we're in the chorus, and we want to, in a way, welcome a really, really spectacular project. And I think it's very nice for those of us in the room from Columbia to listen in to the kind of thinking as it's evolved. And I think you're in the last weekend of the show. So I also like the discussions that happen at the end are generally better than the discussions that happen at the beginning. So I think it might be quite special, this particular one. Anyway, welcome very much. And I'm literally handing the school over to the Saarinen project.
Thank you, Dean Wigley, for the introduction. I'm Juulia Kauste. I'm the director of the Finnish Cultural Institute. one of the three organizers of the Eero Saarinen Shaping the Future exhibition that also the whole entire Saarinen project encompasses in addition to the exhibition also a 2-year research project that was led by Eva-Liisa Pelkonen, one of our speakers today, as well as the publication of this book as a result of that 2-year research project. The book has done extremely well and has won several significant awards, such as the Sir Bannister Fletcher Award for the best book in art and architecture in 2006, as well as the Philip Johnson Best Exhibition Catalog in 2006. So today we're here to reflect on the contemporary relevance of the work of Eero Saarinen. And this is around the time of his centenary, but also this is almost 50 years after his untimely death. And the amazing, condensed, very successful career that he managed to go through within a time of about 10 years in his 40s. We're going to have 3 speakers, 2 of whom have contributed to this book. So Eva-Liisa Pelkonen, who was the leader of the research team, as well as Reinhold Martin, who contributed to the book. And then the 3rd speaker is speaking as a practicing architect, Marc Tsurumaki of the Tsurumaki Lewis LTL Architects. And without going into any further detail about the project or Saarinen's career, which I'm sure Eva and Reinhold will talk plenty about, I will just briefly introduce the speakers and let them do the rest of the talking. So Eva-Liisa Pelkonen is an associate professor at Yale School of Architecture, where she teaches design, history, and theory of architecture, and directs the Masters of Environmental Design program. She holds a Master of Architecture from Tampere Technical University in Finland, a Master's of Environmental Design degree from Yale, as well as a PhD from Columbia University. And she's the author of 3 books, Achtung Architecture, Image and Phantasm in Contemporary Austrian Architecture, and the Eero Saarinen Shaping the Future, which she co-edited with the exhibition curator Donald Albrecht, and Alra Aalto, Architecture, Modernity and Geopolitics, which was published by Yale University Press in 2009. Currently, she's working on doing research on Kevin Roach, an architect who was Saarinen's right-hand man and who guided through many of the important works of Saarinen that were still not completed at the time of his death. I believe that this is also going to turn into an exhibition as well as a book. And today, Eva will be talking about Saarinen's search for communicative form. And Reinhold Martin is an associate professor here at Columbia. He also directs the PhD program in architecture, as well as the Temple Buell Center of the Study of American Architecture. He is a co-founding editor of the journal Grey Room and has published widely on the history and theory of modern and contemporary architecture. He's the author of The Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, the co-author with Kanambari Baxi of Multinational City, Architectural Itineraries, and his new book on postmodernism titled Utopia's Ghost is forthcoming this spring from the University of Minnesota Press. And he will be talking about what is material and Saarinen's relationship to material. And then Marc Tsurumaki is an architect and a founding partner of Tsurumaki Lewis, an award-winning design partnership that explores the opportunistic overlap between form, program, and materiality. The New York-based firm has completed academic, institutional, residential, and hospitality projects through the United States and was awarded the 2007 National Design Award for Interior Architecture, as well as the 2007 James Beard Award for Best Restaurant Design. Their work is part of several museum collections and has been exhibited widely and written about a lot. He's also co-author of Opportunistic Architecture that was published in 2008, as well as Situation Normal, pamphlet Architecture number 21. The firm's current work includes Art House, which is a center for not-for-profit arts organization in Austin, Texas, a villa in Oders, Inner Mongolia, as well as a new administrative campus for the Claremont University Consortium in California. He's currently serving as on the board of trustees for the Van Allen Institute, on the jury for the 2009 Cooper Hewitt National Design Awards, and the 2009 panel to award grants in architecture for the New York State Council for the Arts. And now I will give it over to Eva.
Thank you. Is this a good, like, good distance? Saarinen's architecture and its reception has always hinged on the question of form, its genesis and its meaning. And that's something actually that the word shaping kind of alludes to, this idea of form making that was one of the enigmas, I think, for all of us. By the way, how do I go forward with the keyboard? Oh, there. Oh, that's brilliant. His somewhat unorthodox approach to form, particularly its relationship to structure, is apparent in these two chair designs. On the left, you see a patent drawing for the famous tulip chair that for me personally was the kind of trigger for this exploration. As you might know, the story goes that Florence Knoll, the client in this case, asked for a chair that would get rid of the slum of legs. So there was this sort of conceptual premise. And what is intriguing about this, that if you know the chair, and you probably do, it looks like it's uniform material. It looks very seamless, monolithic, but when you look at the section, there's actually a huge, the leg is hollow, and it has a huge clump of steel hidden, that works as a, keeps the balance. So in a way, the form itself doesn't reveal how it actually works. Something similar is at stake at the chair on the right, which is the chair Saarinen designed in 1940 with Charles Eames for the organic home design in home furnishings competition at MoMA, a competition they won. In this case, the conceptual premise was quite wonderful, the idea to combine the seat, the armrests, and the back into one single form by bending. It's actually the first case where you bend plywood in two directions, which was quite difficult. The original intention was not to upholster the chair, but because the plywood started splintering, they had to do so. So again, in both cases, one could say that the conceptual idea and the formal diagram came first. Technique and structure were figured out later. So that's the radicalness of his form making that I'm after tonight. So 3 interpretations of how his forms came into being and what they meant have dominated his reception since the first buildings for the General Motors Technical Center, his breakthrough project, were built in Warren, Michigan in the early 50s. The first one, put forward by Philip Johnson in the 1952 exhibition built in the USA, post-war architecture, argued that the styling building, seen here in the picture, followed structural and material logic, And if you look at the text here, it starts simply by saying constructed in steel, framed, filled with blocks of bricks and glass, something of that sort. So the interpretation implied that Saarinen was a solid modernist worthy of MoMA's endorsement. The second interpretation, which emerged in the popular press around the same time, is captured in these fashion photographs from the Look magazine. They used the same building, styling building, as a backdrop for these depictions of the new look by highlighting the building's slick material qualities and luxurious atmosphere. And an article at the Playboy magazine at the same time, Playboy magazine out of all places, gave this type of qualities an explicit representational quality by arguing that the exuberance, finesse, and high imagination characterizing US design was superior to the less is more attitude of the Europeans. So here there is no talk about structural logic, it's all about effects, atmosphere, and so forth. Historians of the modern movement, particularly Europeans, were less enthusiastic about Saarinen's formal exuberance and whether they fit into the modernist canon. Bruno Zevi, for example, commenting in 1956 on the newly finished buildings at MIT, the Kresge Chapel and Auditorium, denounced Saarinen as a mannerist architect breaking off from the form follows function rule. Saarinen's overt embrace of picturesque historicism at Yale's Morse and Stiles colleges led to the final blow of his reputation as a solid modernist. After seeing the colleges in 1962, Rainer Banham considered it suspiciously state-set-like and proclaimed, "Yale is a sick place." Saarinen gets only a passing and mostly unfavorable mention in subsequently in major surveys of modern architecture, including Professor Frampton's that you all study here. By the 1980s, Saarinen had become known as the architect who did as much, if not more than any other, to kill the socio-aesthetic project of modernism by approaching architecture, presumably based on what Banham called the style for the job attitude. So, how to make sense of Saarinen's design approach without resorting into this dichotomy between formal effects and structural logic, which has little relevance in today's architectural discourse? Saarinen's 1956 article, 6 Pillars of Architecture, the closest he ever came to defining a set of architectural principles, gives some guidance. It is organized in 2 categories. The first 3, functional integrity, honest expression of structure, and awareness of our time, corresponded to what he considered the modernist dogma: form follows function, structure, and zeitgeist. Saarinen called them timeless principles of architecture. The latter 3, expression of the building, concern for total environment, and carrying the concept to the ultimate conclusion, put emphasis on perception and experience. These should of course be 4, 5, and 6. The goal of the second group was to take the modern architecture beyond what he called the measly ABC, represented by the 3. Saarinen supported this argument by a history lesson. According to him, 1920s and 1930s was dominated by the principle form follows function. The 1940s brought interest in technological and scientific development, and the 50s, as Saarinen puts it, quote, "The leaders of the new generation refused to stop. We, I shall say, because it was my generation, felt that there must still be time for search," unquote. For Saarinen, the search, and these are actually pictures of all the buildings that were incomplete at the time of Saarinen's death and completed posthumously, so 9 of all, but it gives you a sense of the formal diversity that we are dealing with and how difficult it's been always to make sense of that. For Saarinen, the search meant most of all filtering through unprecedented amount of new technical and formal possibilities, programmatic challenges, and historical precedents. Here Saarinen resorts to list making to describe the many opportunities and choices facing architects of his generation. I quote, "There were new and significant things to be done in structure. A whole science of concrete thin cell construction was developing exciting new possibilities. There were new and unexplored materials. There were new things coming out of Europe from Corbu and his followers. And above all, the challenges of the great variety of problems to be solved seemed to indicate a greater variety of answers than modern style tolerated." He endorsed borrowing from modern masters in equally fluid and excessive way, and used the culinary metaphor to describe the circulation and reappropriation of forms that characterized mid-century architecture. He writes, "Mixed together, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe make a broth, which is modern architecture. In different parts of the world, the ingredients of the broth have different proportions." Unquote. Increased information led to increased number of formal choices. Subsequently, forms could be experienced and understood in many ways. To use Saarinen's own metaphor, meanings too became as liquid as broth. All in all, Saarinen suggested that by the late 50s, architects had become information processors. Saarinen used, and this is my main argument today, form to govern the information flow, both during and after its conception. In order to achieve this, he called for formal and conceptual consistency and the need to create a total environment in order for the building to make, quote, "fullest impact and expression," unquote. He cites the TWA terminal as successful demonstration of this approach, and I quote, "I have come to the conviction that once one embarks on a concept for a building, this concept has to be exaggerated and overstated and repeated in every part of its interior, so that wherever you are, inside or outside, the building sings with the same message. This is why, for instance, the interior of the TWA had to be the way it is," unquote. In TWA, this approach translated into curvilinear shapes which twist and turn endlessly. At times, he even compromised structural and material logic to achieve this formal consistency. And this section is actually telling this of the GSAPP side, where you see that the structure is actually, this kind of reminds of the tulip chair again, is behind, and this is not concrete, it's plaster. So it's, again, this sort of things that really work against the kind of form follows structure dogma. Charles Eames's photograph of a child climbing on a warped surface demonstrates how the ideal user acted out the building's formal dynamism. The close-up view of the parents in front make the point that such totalizing architecture could never be contemplated from distance. People merged with the buildings, a sign of complete homology between form and experience. Saarinen's use of surface patterns, for example, facade arrangements that don't rely on intrinsic material, structural, or functional qualities, is based on the same strategy, although the formal outcome differs. Here, formal rigor is exaggerated to the point that form starts to govern information flow. The precast concrete facade in his Oslo embassy, which is here in the picture, serves as an example. It is conceived as a mullion wall, originally developed by the engineer Felix Samueli, where the load of the floor slabs is carried by prefabricated panels around the perimeter of the building without revealing quite how it works on the exterior. So here you see the way it's made. So the floor is here, then comes the window, a floor slab again, and then kind of in an alternating pattern, the next level of elements are stacked up. Saarinen describes how this, how functional, structural, and material factors and qualities translated into the surface pattern as follows, unquote. Here again you see the section. So this is the edge of the precast element, and then there are these filler panels there. So he writes, the precast facade is the most interesting and successful part of this building. Our attempt was to integrate the model on which the offices were all based with the structural system so that one could conceive, all in all, a precast modular system with an integrated facade material. Saarinen continued to describe how, quote, as one walks along Drammensveien, the road next to it, these structural units seem to become changing checkerboard of matte and shiny, light and dark surfaces, unquote. The pattern is created here by the passerby who, seduced by the flickering surface, starts to look for such regularity. The facade acts thus as a kind of interactive surface interface which activates the viewer to reenact its making. The Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, also known as the St. Louis Arch, serves as another example of Saarinen's ability to govern multiple levels of meaning with a single formal gesture. Its seamless stainless steel surface gives no indication how it's actually constructed in parts, and that the load-bearing concrete structure is actually hidden behind the stainless steel cladding. And this is one of these wonderful, beautiful working drawings we found at the Yale archives, which shows, I mean, this is, remember, before computer, the dimensions of every single piece, all of them different, of course. I mean, it's a mirror, so you get two of the same kind, and how they were stacked up from the two directions at once. Quite an incredible tour de force. Nor could one tell from a distance that the structure is hollow and full of infrastructure, including two elevators which carry people to the top. This is one of these sort of original renderings with the women in high heel shoes and period costumes, and this is actually how it was built. I actually heard the story that it was extremely difficult for them to find an elevator constructor to build the elevator, and they finally found, the Otis didn't want to take the job, they found a company that did Ferris wheels to construct it. The form itself mediates between, which is a weighted catenary curve. The form itself mediates between structural logic, geometric principles, and historical reference point. Here's Saarinen with the different arches, and here this. He actually altered the original design, which was closer to catenary curve, and for visual reasons purely made it weighted catenary. The arch offers also a case study what can happen when architecture relies on purely formal strategies for communications. Meanings become unstable. In fact, the original meaning of the arch has now been lost. This is the kind of first reception of the arch when it was when Saarinen was announced the winner. The park commissioner accused Saarinen for plagiarism, plagiarizing Piacentini's monument for the the 20th anniversary of Italian fascism, which is quite different, actually much wider arch. And so here, to sum up the argument, it's my own drawing. I couldn't do it with the computer. This idea that the form governs the information flow that I've repeated in the course of this lecture. That during the design process, and always emphasizes this sort of list of things that you have to consider: the structure, the circulation, all these things that somehow then are merged into one form. And after that, it can also be experienced in many ways. It can gain a semantic meaning, it can be a spatial meaning, it have all sorts of things that also change in time. So it kind of becomes this sort of funnel diagram. So Saarinen's reception proves that what we already know, form is the most difficult and misunderstood concept in architectural discourse. At worst, it is used exclusively to refer to buildings that depart from regular geometric shapes. This narrow use of the term was explicit already during Saarinen's lifetime. While the popular press celebrated his use of such forms as a welcome departure from the dominantly geometric language of modern architecture, here's a spread from Harper's Bazaar, which was actually titled Counter-Revolution in Architecture. While historians like Vincent Scully condemned these same buildings, particularly the Yale hockey rink, for, quote, formal exhibitionism and structural pretension. We must, however, be reminded that during the 1950s, the idea of purely formal and visual communication had a larger echo chamber. Appropriately, the cover of the 1959 Met exhibition, Form Givers at Mid-Century, which included a big section on Saarinen, was designed by Kyrgo Kepes. And this is, of course, very interesting that, first of all, that this cover is white. I don't know if you can quite see, but there's this sort of indents, circles and squares, but this sort of total getting rid of images of color, anything that might have representational quality, and resorting to a kind of purely formal play with form and teasing out the expressive qualities of those forms. His book, Kepes's book, Language of Vision, puts forward a thesis how forms communicate on a purely visual level. What Kepes called optical communication is based on the idea that, quote, visual language is capable of disseminating knowledge more effectively than almost any other vehicle of communication. It is universal and international. It knows no limits of tongue, vocabulary, or grammar, and it can be perceived by the literate as well as the illiterate. True, Saarinen's architecture is not difficult to grasp. It offers something for everybody. I always say that your grandmother would get Saarinen. There's always somebody, you always have an access point to him. The Yale hockey rink is my personal favorite in this regard. While a layman might read the exterior form as a whale or a Viking helmet, it is known in New Haven as the Yale whale, the interior has pure visceral impact. Anyone who visits the building, particularly during a hockey game, feels invigorated. A contemporary architect is particularly drawn to how different architectural and programmatic elements fold to one another. And this is interesting. First of all, it's interesting to see how the section, the curve used in the section is the same as the curve, the retaining walls at the exterior. And this actually, it's better than any photograph, shows how it works. It's quite brilliant. The ramp, so there are no kind of stairs. The ramps take you to the bleachers. It's kind of like an interior landscape that goes like this. And it merges the programmatic, the structure, everything is merged into one. The form again becomes the governor of the plan. The building proves Saarinen's thesis: a single formal move, when consistently applied, is the most efficient tool to coordinate programmatic, structural, and semantic information. Susan Langer's 1953 best-selling book, Feeling and Form. laid a philosophical foundation for how forms enter human consciousness and what effect they have on us. While acknowledging that forms had a special power on the looker, she insisted that the word message was misleading and replaced it with the concept symbol, which she inherited from her teacher Ernst Cassirer, who used it to refer to holy sensory experience, which, according to him, touched the very essence of human life, namely freedom. Following Cassirer, Lange continued to believe in the total homology between aesthetics and ethics, between form and life. And here I read a quote that's very, very beautiful that I don't think I can do quite justice. Symbolic expression is something miles removed from efficient planning or good arrangement. It does not suggest things to do, but embodies the feeling, the rhythm, the passion, or sobriety, frivolity, and fear with which any things at all are done. That is the image of life which is created in buildings. It is the visible semblance of an ethic domain, the symbol of humanity to be found in the strength and interplay of forms. Like Lange, Saarinen seems to have believed that human beings are hardwired to receive aesthetic impulses, that forms touch the inner core of our humanity like no other medium. I would argue that Saarinen's best buildings, and here again I would like to refer to the Yale hockey rink, reach this level of symbolic communication without having to rely on semantic meanings. Saarinen seems to have believed that the ability to govern information and experience through such non-verbal and indeed non-cerebral ways became increasingly important as human beings had to navigate through more and more information on a daily basis. True, Saarinen's search for communicative form failed to address many social problems, and he can be criticized for lacking a clear project, but he does not deserve credit for creating a few spaces and forms which make one feel at least momentarily happy to be alive and share a space with fellow human beings. The rest, he probably thought, would follow. Thank you.
Let's see. So, I'm told I have 20 minutes in the spirit of Scandinavian precision and with respect to Eva's commitment there too, through the duration of this now more than 5-year-long project. I start the timer now. Thanks to everyone for coming and to our colleagues for joining us in what really has been, we were calculating, over 5 years of work and discussion on Saarinen's work, a kind of very systematic research project, in fact, that I think, it really is a kind of unusual exercise in the context of traveling exhibitions and the such, that a research team would be brought together across the Atlantic and work together to develop not just an exhibition and a catalog, but really an interpretive framework, a kind of strategy, a way of thinking. So in fact, I hope that at least aspects of the conversation that we'll have afterwards would reflect, the sort of knowledge and insights accumulated over those years. At the other end of this arc, to refer to arches, I sort of thought, I realized that it had been about 5 years. It was actually 5 years since I at least submitted the final draft of the article that I wrote for the book that Eva showed you, so it sort of was an opportunity to think, to reflect really on the content and really arguments in that piece, and to try to talk a little bit about it, but more about what it doesn't say, what I have since learned, or at least since felt it important to add to some of this research. So in that sense, I want to say that I think one of the things that we've kind of concluded in a sense is that Saarinen remains an enigma. I mean, as an architect, it's always hard to tell whether you're looking at serious architecture when you're looking at a Saarinen building. It's also hard to tell whether to take the writings seriously or the correspondence and all the other materials that we have sifted through in our own ways. And at what level and what register should this work and its surrounding practices be interpreted? I would prefer to let it be. Let Saarinen remain an enigma. It's more interesting that way. And in translating into a more contemporary, as it were, framework to suggest that we learn to think historically about such enigmas as are presented by this work. And what I mean by that historically, I don't mean that like citing it or copying it or somehow using it itself as a kind of resource for contemporary design. I actually mean to think again about what it means to historicize a work and a body of work and its architect. And so what I want to suggest first is that in the case of Saarinen, it might involve, at least it has in my own interest and work around his work, a kind of consideration of architecture, reconsideration of architecture, reframing of architecture, very specifically as what we can call a technical medium. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. In the essay for the catalog, it was sort of interesting to think about the materiality of that medium and its sort of technical production. And I'll show you a couple of slides from that. And then maybe what can be added, what I think I could add right now to that are some reflections on what we can call a kind of immaterial materiality, or really more precisely a material immateriality, because and it's exactly in that sense that I want to insist that we're dealing with technical media here. So anyway, the question, what is a material, is the one that I thought it was interesting to pose to this work in the context of the exhibition. And the short answer is that any material, the kind of materials that architects use every day is in a sense, in its essence, inessential, which means that it is in fact a cultural construction, or to put it another way, a nature-culture hybrid. So here you see, this is Saarinen and company, some of his team and clients, surveying the site for the John Deere headquarters. And it's very important, this is a building sort of famously positioned sensitively on its site. And it's important to recognize that from the very beginning, the site selection and orientation, kind of technical apparatus, such as the one that you see here, is necessary and part, in a sense, of the production of the sort of site. At the other end of that site, in a sense, or that production, is the material, the kind of what we more traditionally call a material in architecture, because I'm implying that the site itself belongs to the material complex of architecture, is this object. This is one of the many mock-ups that the Saarinen firm did for the project for John Deere. I'm not showing you pictures of the project so much, because you should go see the show if you haven't seen it. But here, this is a mock-up they did on the site of the Core-10 steel that we use in the facade to test how it rusts in the weather. Another sort of similar procedure. This is Saarinen and Kevin Roche looking at the stone that was eventually used in the CBS building, which was mocked up in another mock-up, and then again the sort of invention of a certain technique for concrete at TWA, not so much to produce a particular form, but in the interests of, as it were, materializing the sort of abstractions that we call materiality. This is maybe a little itself abstract, but what I mean by that is the set of forces and the set of, both at the level of production, like all the engineers and all the apparatus that's necessary to produce that roof, but also the ideas, the techniques, the types of drawings, the discourses, the histories, all the agents, all the kind of operators. In short, what we can call a network of discourses that out of which an image like that kind of emerges. Okay, so here's another dome for you, or really a series of domes. This is the Kresge auditorium at MIT, kind of photographed in the way the photographer probably thought that the architect wanted it to be photographed, as one among many domes. And off to the side you see the chapel. What I would like to just mention at this point is that this particular project, I think, represents a kind of crisis for the firm in its kind of internal history. There are various problems around the construction of this dome, and so on. But probably, but more to the point here, it represents a kind of problem for us historically in thinking our categories, in a sense utilizing and in a sense producing the discursive categories by which we need to understand this. And what I mean is that what this photograph, this ensemble, effectively demands is something that I actually don't think really exists in any systematic way yet, and that is a properly secular history of architecture. Because what you're looking at, of course, is not just an auditorium, you're also looking at a chapel, and you're looking at the implicit correlation of the dome type, the sort of history of domes that, including, this is of course alluding, the dome over there alludes to the dome over here at Lowe Library. The relationship between domes and universities, and, or to put it another way, religious forms with religious origins, and monuments to secular humanism. So MIT has a kind of problem here. The problem is that there's no religion in MIT. And this is a significant problem in the post-war period, and it's in a sense the problem that produces the Saarinen complex. But what it produces, I'm getting ahead of myself a bit here, but what it produces for us is a kind of confusion between secular and religious meanings when we try to understand these works. So, okay, just a little bit of information. The auditorium and chapel complex were funded by the Kresge Foundation, who had supported a lot of religious institutions, and they had a kind of interest in religious education. And they were opened in 1955. They were the result of a grant process that was started prior to the war, and its shepherd, its kind of custodian, was a figure by the name of John Burchard, who was an architectural historian, and eventually Dean of Humanities at MIT. And the Kresge name was initially to be attached to a department of humanities at MIT. That was meant to sort of counterbalance what by that point, even before the war, and especially after the war, was perceived as the kind of predominance of kind of instrumental, technological, or kind of technocratic sort of knowledge. So in other words, MIT, this is what I mean by the sort of problem that MIT didn't have religion, was constructed as the problem that MIT didn't have a soul. It was lacking spirit. It was pure science, pure rationality, pure calculation. And so the humanists were called in, or Burchard, they called themselves in the form of figures like Burchard, and it was exactly out of that process of eventually actually founding a department of humanities at MIT that this strange complex emerged, simply because it reproduced the problem. It reproduced the problem by failing to reconcile the humanities and religion, or secular knowledge, with theology. In other words, the two buildings, represented by the two buildings, the dome, the auditorium as a kind of secular bourgeois public sphere in which events like this would occur, and critical discourse, in other words, and the chapel as a site of for the return, in effect, of theology to the university, which you may know it begins. Most American universities, MIT accepted, begin as religious institutions. So how to, in a sense, to understand this, how to interpret this strange conflict. In fact, the two buildings were in the programs that were written at the beginning. They were meant to be together, and this site plan was only the result of this whole kind of process, institutional process, committees, memos, jockeying, and so on, that split them apart. So what you're looking at, in effect, is a kind of contradiction. Now, what is the architecture of that contradiction, let's say? Well, Each building, I think it's maybe better put that each building in the ensemble, there was supposed to be a third, there was meant to be a student union, but that was built later, but by another architect. But this ensemble, each one of them resolves the contradiction in a different way, and I want to suggest in its capacity as technical medium. And it does that by manipulating two materials together that we don't always think of. And sometimes we do, but in a sense, these buildings are formed around these materials. And those are the materials of light and sound. And so, this is partly what I mean by a kind of immaterial materiality, that it's exactly the manipulation of light and the manipulation of sound, these material processes, that much of the technical expertise, the formal invention, and the discursive, let's say, construction of these two buildings kind of invokes. So, okay, so here's the secular bourgeois public sphere. Quite literally, it's 1/8 of a sphere, and this is a study model. And again, many study models. The office was quite famous for that. To set up to study the workings of the interior. You see the acoustic panels, and then inside another model, the sort of focus on the stage. Both of them involve the problem of focus, which is a formal problem if you're using this kind of geometry. And you'll see that also has to do with the light. Here's the photo. The light is focused on the stage, as is and the sound obviously is reflected back out. And so, in that sense, this interior is a kind of machine for focusing, for paying attention what's happened, like as is this interior, but this is in a sense a much more sophisticated and subtle one, a machine for focusing attention on the events going on the stage, which are intended, as I said, to be theater performances, lectures like this, and other kind of humanistic endeavors. This machine is a different one. This is the interior of the chapel. Again, it's a machine for focusing attention on the center. And again, light is used very, very specifically to draw that attention to the center. In this case, this is a through the kind of combination of two different sort of sources of focus. The ceiling aperture shimmering down onto the altar, and then the uplighting coming, reflecting up off of the water that is in the moat that's surrounding the building. And here's the working drawing. I'm just going to leave this here for you to try to figure out. But a great deal of technique was involved in developing these blind arches under which the water, the reflections from the water become visible on the interior, and again the skylight and the other kind of devices sort of at the perimeter, including the undulating wall in the interior, which you don't really see in this drawing. So this is a machine for facilitating the return of theology to the campus, and I think really does need to be understood in those terms. The two buildings together materialize quite directly a kind of contradiction, a conflict, and at least an ambiguity that arises from the encounter between secular humanism and religion. It's a very classic encounter, as I said, on American campuses, and architecture has long participated in this. Our problem, in a sense, I think, I want to insist, is in effect to secularize the interpretation of that encounter, which is to say, to learn to read it critically, and in that respect, in that sense, to take some distance from the desire to reclaim this architecture, however deft it may be, into the sort of canon, a religious term, by the way, you probably know, of modern architecture. because to do that would inevitably and systematically be to import its kind of crypto-theology, and it would do so at the expense, I think, of the very valuable and very important idea that what modernism means is a kind of form of secular cultural production. And it's one of the great myths of modern architecture that it's, you know very well that there are many churches and temples and other such buildings designed by modernist architects. Saarinen did quite a few himself, and he usually use these devices for manipulating the light to do them. But it does seem rather important to a kind of move, an interpretive move, to do now, like in this moment, to, in a sense, resist the temptation to resolve the contradiction in the form of what we can call a kind of theological humanism, a humanism that, in a sense, displaces the explicit, or abstracts, to use the modernist language, the explicit iconographic and sort of referential discourse of particularly of Christianity, onto this kind of spiritual plane with which a lot of post-war architecture, Le Corbusier, Saarinen, Kahn, and others, has been interpreted. We can, or to put it the other way around, every time you hear the word spirit connected with this architecture, you should recognize that what you're witnessing is a kind of religious turn, and that needs to be taken seriously, I think, in effect, defense of the very important Enlightenment idea that there is a difference between secular knowledge and theology, rather than their kind of resolution in this theological humanism. So it's a funny thing because Saarinen himself never really talked about any of this. I mean, it was not really a preoccupation. He did worry a little bit that one of the problems for architects was to design chapels. He complained that nobody really knew how to do it when he was talking about Nice. And he said this is maybe something he could contribute, because there were a lot, and I think he had the idea that there was a lot of this work to be had. His father was also, Elio Saarinen was an architect of religious buildings. And so it's not, out of the blue or nothing, but it's nevertheless of its moment. It's a very particular moment in which war had produced a kind of crisis of a kind of moral crisis, particularly places like MIT, where the bomb was partly produced, or at least the knowledge that produced it, and there was a desire, a kind of let's say ethical sort of reflex to try to correct for that by appealing to this kind of spirituality in the guise of the humanities, and then eventually connecting that back up with religion. So in a way, a kind of historical question that we could ask that's of relevance to us now might be something like, how could it have been done differently? And with that, I think I will leave you, because this is about to go off. Thank you.
Good evening. I hate to begin this way, but a couple of caveats. One is that I did want to clarify that I'm probably the one speaker tonight that hasn't been involved in this sort of longer research project surrounding Saarinen. But I've been asked, both as a design professor here at GSAPP, and also as a practicing architect, to comment both on Reinhold and Eeva-Liisa's work in the context of the book, but also to comment a bit more broadly on the potential kind of relevance of Saarinen from that standpoint, from the standpoint of an architect in contemporary practice today. This position, of course, both worries me a bit, but at the same time, what I'm hoping is that it gives me a bit of an excuse for any lack of intellectual rigor or historical accuracy in the observations that will follow. And I would like to apologize as well to Reinhold and Eva, who have provided me with a bit of a moving target tonight, since I'll be principally reacting to their research as presented in the book. However, I did want to make a few comments tonight as well that begin to not recuperate Saarinen or to try to drag him into contemporary discourse as a kind of progenitor for our obsessions today, but rather to use him in a sense to unpack certain ideas, certain predilections or obsessions within his work, which are in many ways still relevant for us and in some level assumed or even kind of normalized within contemporary practice, and in that sense have become sort of difficult to examine. So that by looking at the kind of historical context of Saarinen, we may be able to shed some light on these in a somewhat different way. So to begin, and at the risk of oversimplifying the distinctions between the presentations we've just heard, here beginning with Reinhold's work, they do share this kind of common theme of identifying contradictions in Saarinen's work between the technical aspects of materiality and structure on the one hand, and their status as image and representation on the other. In the case of Reinhold's essays, materials are seen as comprising not only their intrinsic natural qualities, but also as complicit in the construction of images that carry cultural and social meaning, a condition in which material and image are not conceived as oppositional, but rather as reciprocal and inextricably bound together. The final status of the building in these instances is therefore neither a postmodern detachment of semiotic effect from constructional reality. This is a CBS building, mock-up testing for those panels, nor the modernist honesty in the expression of material and structure. What we're left with instead is a kind of contradiction or a paradox in which the conventional dichotomy between the strictly rational and the expressive or aesthetic qualities of the building are left in an unresolved suspension, an oscillation between the corporeal and the immaterial, which we've seen sort of expanded tonight to, into the realm of the virtual and the manipulation of light as an aspect of material as well. Similar, Eeva-Liisa, in her work, tracks the emergence of a preference for the communicative and expressive dimensions of form in Saarinen's work. Again, this is seen as opposed to the first generation modernist reliance on the purely functional principles of modernist discourse, or at the same time a postmodernist recourse to explicit historical references. The essay suggests that Saarinen's development of an immersive aesthetics, predicated on generating a central perception of space, what the critic Robin Boyd termed felt space, is tied to corresponding contemporary interests in the communicative potential of visual art. This was not seen in terms of a kind of direct symbolic content of the architectural image, as in TWA equals bird in flight, but rather in the emergence of meaning as an emotional response to psychospatial stimuli. What is interesting here is that the communicative content of Saarinen's work is not simply reducible to its circulation value in an economy of mediated images, publications, photographs, or representations, but rather directly tied to a subjective experience of the building itself. Nevertheless, he suggests that this trajectory paves the way for a condition in which the architectural form becomes increasingly dissociated from its context or its production. And in any case, here Saarinen can be seen, and he has been famously spoken of as an architect who recognized the critical role of contemporary media. But here as well, one who understood that the building itself exists as a form of media, one whose primary function is to communicate to the viewer through an assembly of effects. In both of these instances, we find Saarinen identified as an architect who would make the conscious and, quote, dangerous decision to privilege the more beautiful over the, quote, structural and rational, unquote. What is critical here is the identification of a kind of a moment of productive paradox when the orthodoxies of modernist rationality began to give way to the emergence of new sensibilities regarding architecture's expanded role in an increasingly affluent consumerist society. For Saarinen, this meant a broadening of architecture's purview from the narrow codifications of dogmatic modernism toward a richer and more inclusive approach which would admit a greater variety of answers that modernist style tolerated. This last quote of Saarinen's. This hybridity of Saarinen's practice resulted in divergent strains of experimentation and multiplicity of form that generated some of his harshest criticism as well as some of his most provocative work. While various elements of Saarinen's hybridity can be seen as having re-emerged in the form of certain tendencies within contemporary practice, from the plastic expression of complex geometries, perhaps prefigured in the line of evolution that stretches from Kresge to Ingles hockey rink and finally to Dulles Airport, or the experimentations with the material effects of surfaces, often as in Saarinen's work at projects like Bell or IBM, articulating otherwise mute functional boxes. What is fascinating here is, to me at least, is not the ability to track the lineages of this work into the present, but rather the incredible diversity and multiplicity of approaches that Saarinen and his collaborators were actually able to deploy in a comparatively brief, though wildly prolific career. What can be seen as having bifurcated into ideologically opposed directions in contemporary practice, say plastic form versus elaboration of surface, were in fact being deployed simultaneously at Saarinen's office, presumably without any trepidations regarding stylistic consistency. It is precisely this inability to be categorized, an inability to locate a substance or even a consistent style among the multiplication of forms, which is at once frustrating and fascinating about Saarinen. Just as it is this perceived multiplicity that led Rainer Banham to call him, with equal parts admiration and derision, the perfect ad man. However, the apparent ease with which Saarinen negotiated the plurality of formal strategies in the service of corporate clientele belies the seriousness, which is not to say the obsessiveness, with which he experimented to arrive at these diverse architectural solutions, and his own critical self-awareness regarding the success or failure of his work. His evaluation, for example, of the Kresge Auditorium, which we just seen as looking like a half-inflated balloon, or his defense of the diverse approaches that characterized his practice. What Saarinen described in terms of a search can be seen in light of a general sense of unease and anxiety regarding architectural practice and discourse that was sort of in the air at the time. In this sense, Tafori's later evaluation of Saarinen's work in terms of pathology, a quote-unquote neuroses of form, is not inconsistent with the evaluations of Saarinen among his professional contemporaries. As Eva also points out in her essay, Saarinen's productive period coincided with not only the era of post-war American affluence, but also a state of unprecedented pluralism and even confusion within contemporary architectural practice, so much so that it was dubbed the period of chaoticism in a contemporary article in Progressive Architecture magazine. What can be seen in retrospect as an exuberant period, wherein the prescriptive aspects of modernist dogma were giving way to a vital experimentation with form, structure, materials, and technology, can also be seen as a time of increasing anxiety regarding a crisis of meaning in architecture. It would be perhaps tempting to note that the anxieties and potentials that characterize these debates, the loss of any consensual basis for an architectural aesthetics, a fascination with new materials and technologies, and the potential to generate form, and an apparently uncritical embrace of new economies as spaces in which architects to operate, have their parallels in our own situation. However, as architects practicing in a context which has become ever more fragmented, complex, and diverse, it may seem nostalgic or even quaint today to look back at Saarinen's perceived failings and transgressions, and the controversy that surrounded his then radical proliferation of forms, especially in a time when the pursuit of the newer novel has reached a kind of fever pitch. While I would want to resist the desire to drag Saarinen into the present as some form of progenitor for contemporary practice, it nevertheless may be useful to unpack some of Saarinen's own preoccupations, if for no other reason than to examine issues which are now assumed and to some degree therefore taken for granted within architectural practice today. In this light, I want to conclude by briefly reflecting on Saarinen's relationship to technology and experimentation on the one hand, and to methodology and the constraints of program on the other. A great sort of opponent of orthodoxy, Saarinen was also deeply committed to the notion of the zeitgeist and believed that he was searching for the appropriate expression for 20th century culture. On the one hand, this surfaced in the obsession with technical advancement, what Vincent Scully called the whammo functional innovation, the neoprene gaskets at GM, the Corten at Deere, the mirrored curtain wall at Bell, for example. If this mania for emerging technologies bordered on the fetishistic, prompting one critic to label the St. Louis Arch an enormous gadget, it also involved an extensive process of testing and iteration through the generation of large-scale models and mock-ups of material assemblies. This notion of testing, the willingness to experiment with new techniques and construction methodologies, as well as notions of technological transference, for example, from the automotive industry to architecture, has become part of the ingrained DNA of progressive architectural practices today, at least a certain strain of them. The integration of advanced forms of fabrication, production, and manufacture, especially as regards digital technologies and new environmental building techniques, as well as the notion of an integrated team of technical specialists as part of the design process, has gained currency to the point where these are now often seen as a sufficient condition for architectural production. It is important to note here that for Saarinen, however, the particular technique was always seen as subservient to the demands and content of the project at hand. For Saarinen, these technologies had no intrinsic or correct expression, but had to be guided by the intuition of the designer to find the appropriate form, a process that required continual testing through multiple iterations and careful study of the effects thereof. And again, photos of some of these very large-scale models that were employed famously in the office. In the absence also of any external universally valid formula, Saarinen had recourse to several self-generated principles that he articulated as the 3 new pillars. Eva's already referred to these, in addition to the foundational principles of modern architecture. These again were expression, the total environment, and carrying the concept through to its final conclusion. I want to just think a little bit about this kind of last one, which is, I think, of particular interest to us, in that it would seem to supplant a kind of overarching ideological bias, or the idea of an a priori starting point for architecture, with the idea of an internal consistency to a singular concept, instead derived from the specifics of the project at hand. Rather than an externally generated formal strategy to be repeated regardless of program, client, or context, Saarinen employed the idea of a logical trajectory in which each step was a result of a rational process. It is perhaps this obsessive consistency and the willingness to carry through a line of experimentation or thought to its ultimate and even extreme conclusion that perhaps produces the internal resonance of buildings like the TWA terminal, where the form of seating, built-in seating, or the information desk can be seen as a kind of reiteration of the logics of the building at multiple scales. This expressive unity within the building was in contradiction to the perception of Saarinen as a kind of serial stylist, with its implications of the arbitrary and the capricious. It can also be seen ironically as the very source for the perceived lack of unity in his work when it's conceived as a totality. In defense of this perceived lack of overall consistency, what was called his arbitrary eclecticism, he countered that the specifics of each project generated the logics of the design in each case. Each architectural problem, he argued, including, quote, new problems created by our technology, unquote, had a unique solution which derived from the totality of its concerns and their distillation into an architectural concept. In Saarinen's word, quote, the real significance of the problem. This meant the GM could evidence a technocratic precision based on the repetition of modular form, albeit hybridized with touches of sensualism. The MIT chapel could exist as an exercise in the effects of masonry, light, and water. And TWA could traffic in the muscular exaggeration of structure for perceptual effect, while all would be methodologically unified by an approach which has been characterized again by Benham as the right style for the job. Kevin Roche, one of his closest collaborators in the office, remarked in the recent Yale symposium that Saarinen, quote, never began with form. He had an approach rather similar to a scientist or researcher of starting with trying to define what is the problem, in which he was, quote, absolutely relentless. He goes on to say that, quote, the process was very slow, very, very methodical, and very careful. And by the time he got to thinking about form, he already knew more about the functional aspects, and he had thoroughly investigated also all of the other relationships, the urban design, the cultural environment, all of these things that one normally takes into account. There wasn't a black or white, right or wrong, so evident at any point in time. What there was this extraordinarily careful assembly of the information and research and facts, and at the end of the process, the form would emerge. This insistence on what might broadly be termed program, the collective parameters, constraints, and aspirations that define the project, and a methodical and precise research into their architectural implications reverses the common perception of Saarinen as a facile form giver. What has been dismissed as a kind of crass opportunism on Saarinen's part, as advertising or branding or a pathological neuroses of form, can here be seen as a kind of optimistic engagement with the crucial parameters of each project, one that with an almost hedonistic enthusiasm latched onto the possibilities of new techniques and materials, as well as emerging formats and programs. And so at the end, Saarinen presents another kind of paradox, one in which his formal experimentation, which is probably the condition for which he is best known, can be seen as an effect of a kind of a shift in methodology, one that replaced a preconceived ideological basis for architecture with a process-driven response to a new density of information. Thank you.
This on? Yeah. So thank you so much for extremely interesting presentations. And I think it would be good to open it up to general questions right away if the audience has some particular questions to address to any one of these excellent speakers. Okay, and the last, just a second, you're gonna get the mic.
Oh, okay, thanks. This is, I guess, a question for Eeva-Liisa and Juulia. I guess the talk tonight certainly has talked about Saarinen as an American architect, but yet I think he's always lumped in with being a Finnish architect, and certainly in Finland, you know, it's seen as a Finnish architect. How Finnish do you think is his work and influence from the Finnish architecture scene?
I'm gonna let Eva take it.
For one thing, he didn't, remember that list I gave? He loved lists. He did lists about everything, list about women, list about things to do. But one of the lists he always kept on remaking was the list of architects, the masters, and how he ranked them. I think Aalto was there, but he never made it to the top 3. So later in life he did visit Villa Mairea, but I think there was I don't know. He was Finnish by birth, but I don't think it was. He wasn't. I think. Well, first of all, he was American educated architect, so that makes it very, very complex. So I don't know. It always comes up, but I think it's very difficult to answer. And what would it mean to be a Finnish? I think certainly the influence of Aalto's furniture, and I think Aalto was in a jury for the organic home design competition. There was affinities, technical affinities, material affinities, but I don't know. I think hard to talk about some sort of essence of Finnishness that would somehow naturally, come out of him. So.
How would you ever then think about Saarinen in terms of an international context? Like in your book about Aalto, you talk about Aalto's relationship to the international context and his particular persona as being Finnish within that international context. Then if we think of Saarinen as an American architect or Finnish in an international context, did he have a relationship to an international context?
Of course, the comparison in Aalto in that case is an interesting one, because Aalto so actively sought these connections. He was incredible traveler. He was, spent as much time out of the country as inside the country. That's one of the characteristics of, in a small country you have to go out to if you want to get somewhere. So Aalto certainly was a traveler and active. Contact taker and had a huge network in the end of his life, or actually from early on. But Saarinen was kind of a magnet. The Saarinen office where people came to. It was the kind of reverse, that he was located in the office was in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, but everybody who was somebody came through that office, and people came to work there. So he was never. I think he's kind of from the correspondence. He's in a way, curiously, Aalto, who has never been considered an intellectual, he was much more kind of keeping up with the discourse and with Siam and what was going on. Saarinen was not intellectual in that way, and there's kind of very few comments in his correspondence that indicate that he was really fully kind of embedded in the architectural discourse of his time in a kind of intellectual sense. Yeah. But he was a magnet for talent from all over the world.
But then also we should keep in mind that all of his work he really created in the U.S. apart from a few projects that he worked on, competitions and so on in Finland.
And of course, we can't undermine the fact that his father was an immense influence on him, and his father was definitely a Finnish architect.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind, it's sort of interesting to me to wonder in what sense does that the question of national origins and heritage make sense, and in what sense is that kind of a question interesting today? I'm not denying its interest. I'm just saying that it's quite clear that it's not self-evident in terms. And I also speak, by the way, as the director of the Center for the Study of American Architecture. Juulia represents Finnish Cultural Institute, so we're here to overcome, shall we say, the national frame, but not necessarily in the interest of a kind of default internationalism. Because I must say, Saarinen's father was not a cosmopolitan in the classic modernist sense. He was provincial, but he was right. Yeah. But I'm saying Saarinen, Elio Saarinen, he was not provincial culturally, and I'm not speaking about Finland versus the U.S. If anything, part of what Eero Saarinen, I think, inherited from his father, dare I say, was his American, was a kind of provincialism that he translated into an American provincialism, but in the sense that there was still the residue, especially as you say in Elio, of the desire to define national culture through architecture, and this was one of his important roles, in his home country. He was a bit lost when he came to the States. Elio was. He was scared by Detroit and by people who didn't sort of seem so familiar, and Cranbrook reproduced it. It is in as many ways this environment. I've been talking about the heritage in the background and the teaching Cranbrook really, you can feel it. You can still feel it at Cranbrook. The anxiety about origins and about groundedness and being of a place. And so in that sense, the displacement, I would sort of summarize it, the displacement is sort of basic. It's structural. And the fact that these figures of the 20th century are living that displacement is in a sense more interesting than what they thought they were doing. I think.
So it is interesting about Cranbrook because, of course, Eliel grew up with this in this very kind of like weird enclave near Helsinki. I mean, the family didn't live in the city. They were in this enclave. I mean,
which we all went to, by the way. Sorry,
like in the So in a way, there was. I mean, the same way the Cranbrook is the same similar kind of enclave. I mean, there were like riots going on in Detroit, while they were having masquerades. There's this sort of weird parallel university. So I think that is. It's almost a sense that history was going like in a different track. The family was always moving to these different places and it's kind of in a different temporal frame.
In the middle?
I had a question, I guess, that follows up on his father, maybe not on his provincialism, but on his father's writing on form. Because I know even if Eero didn't write very much, his father produced a fairly hefty book that's all about the derivation of form, both in its sort of organic derivation and its permutations through history, which reads as actually very close to a whole set of, let's say, 19th century German traditions that follow through with Gideon. And I wondered the extent to which, I mean, I know that father and son worked together on a number of pretty interesting projects that, to my knowledge, are not in the Yale archive, not documented there. I wonder, in that sense, about the relationship between the father and son in producing a variation on formal thinking through a modernist idiom, if there's been research on that, or what your thoughts are.
What's yours?
It's interesting. I do talk about it a little bit in the article in the book, and I think it's the book was, again, I think it was important for Eero as well, and I think what he gets from it, there's a kind of a sense, and it comes back to these questions about Saarinen's relationship to time and to place and that there's this sort of sense that this idea of even the circulation of forms, that how there's kind of almost like Kublerian idea that the forms circulate and they can kind of pop up the same forms in different cultural contexts. You take a circle and it kind of this sort of idea of the eternal form and Saarinen was the way he talks about architecture, it's this sort of which for somebody who is taught in modernism, who is like let's talk about what's today and what's really the burning problems of contemporary society, this preoccupation with form that that has this sort of weird historical trajectory that's also very very organic. I think it gives it the kind of adds to the kind of weirdness of Saarinen's, like where to place him historically, because he's preoccupied with this sort of discourse that he inherits from the father, and like you said, from the 19th century really. That's very different from what was going on around him.
I totally agree that the Eliel's writing is underestimated in a sense, but to give there's this funny story. You probably all know this, but when there was the competition for the arch, they both entered it, and this telegram arrives. Saarinen wins, and they broke out the champagne for the father. Later clarified. And I think I've always thought that sort of summarizes this issue, because if anything, I don't want to kind of psychologize the situation so thoroughly, but it does to some extent demand that. In a way, what it demands is a kind of historical lens that is capable of accounting for the father-son relationship psychosocially as well as sort of professionally. Because both are occurring in the office and in the house and everywhere. Everything is happening together all the time. So to be accurate historically, you somehow have to be able to do that. But it's fair to say in the writings that what Saarinen inherits, as it were, in translation into English, sort of from Eliel, is his organicism. But I think he modifies that organicism rather unconsciously, because he doesn't theorize it in any means. You're right. I mean, Eliel's is a kind of 19th century, organicism, has some very curious ideas about race, for example, and things like this. And Eros finds in a kind of, let's say, dispersed discursive environment, a kind of, in other words, not by reading this book and that book and that book, and then like translating those books into the project, but in a sense inserting his the problem of organicism that he, in a sense, has been developing with his father, into the American corporate environment in particular. Arrow innovates a kind of systems organicism, along with others, not just Arrow. And so the curtain wall winds up becoming a kind of unit that can be analogized to the cell, because that's one of the great diagrams in that book, which I think is an interesting but awful book. And in the module and the kind of iteration becomes an open-ended system rather than a closed form. That's another, by the way, in purely formal terms, one of the very interesting dilemmas in trying to make sense of this. Is that there really I'd say there are two classes of Saarinen projects formally. There are the closed forms, which are probably the more famous ones for the most part, and then there are the I think Marc said it well. There are the patterned buildings, the open-ended modular structures. Sometimes they come together. One more quick story. They often, I was trying to suggest that certain problems arise when these things enter the real world. But one of the things that happened in in England, in the London Embassy, in Grosvenor Square, is that they wanted. There was a whole debate in Congress about the eagle. Because it was just a blank building with like a pattern. And so the Congress got involved, the American Congress got involved to insist that there should be a kind of recognizable shape, an eagle, a kind of emblem on there. And I've always thought that they sort of made a joke out of it in the office. I never asked anybody, maybe, I don't know if you're in your discussions ever discovered this, but that you know, it was so gross, it's so enlarged and kind of overblown that it's almost parodic in its actual realization. So anyway, form triumphs.
Mark, did you want to say something?
Well, it was interesting, and this is probably tangential, but it was interested in Reinhold's discussion of the kind of spiritual aspect of, or the kind of conflict at Kresge, the chapel in the auditorium. And if you look at Arrow's own writings on form, there is this odd kind of sort of latent essentialism that kind of surfaces, which kind of, I think, does relate back to an almost kind of romantic notion of a kind of spiritual aspect of kind of formal expression. That, in other words, is, as much as, say, for instance, TWA is celebrated as this kind of symbol of contemporary notions of flight and kind of technological transformation, there's this kind of undercurrent of a kind of a recourse to certain repetitive values or sort of underlying kind of cultural meanings that architecture should convey and carry, that he tends to kind of reiterate in a lot of the brief amounts of text that he does write about his own work. So there is this kind of interesting, and I think it is true, it happens in a way between the two building typologies as well, these more repetitive structures which are based maybe more on organization, and the ones that are more about the kind of organicism relative to the idea of the kind of closed formal expression of these of plastic buildings like TWA. But there's always that sort of undercurrent that I think is kind of present, as sort of latent or implicit within the work.
Well, you would see that, that you know, like the diagram I showed about the arch, this sort of also the obsession, which was not, you know, shared by others, about geometry, and the pure geometric forms, and the kind of essentialism that went hand in hand with that, and the kind of cosmological systems that went.
Yeah, no, I mean, I must say that I feel the need to insist that another name for what we're talking about is theology, and it's not so crypto always. It's not so kind of sublimated or abstracted in Saarinen. Sometimes it is, but in that sense, he can very usefully serve as a sort of cipher, a kind of a means to decode you know, we do usually speak about these things in terms of romanticism, romantic kind of expressionism sometimes, or naturalism, but to decode the sort of quote unquote as a non-secular dimension, dimensions of modernism, and not only in the kind of institutional kind of literal sense of religious buildings. It's one of the great historiographical, I think, problems or dilemmas, and very interesting ones for, you know, kind of writing the history of modern architecture, and it's kind of compounded after the war with in a sense, the religious turn of the country itself. I mean, this goes together with the Eagle because it's also it's also McCarthyism. When they opened the auditorium at MIT, one of the Burchard, the guy from the humanities, was in charge of kind of the opening ceremonies, and so he wanted to get Aaron Copland, the composer, to perform in that. But Copland had his name had appeared on certain lists. This is the 50s, and so they performed a background check on him, and that background check was presented to the president of the university before he was invited. This is now all made public in the MIT archives. You know, and he was judged okay. He was not, you know, yes. And you know, that's the environment in which a lot of this work is done, and it needs to be kind of evaluated with historical kind of specificity. That plus this sort of crisis of conscience that is kind of summarized in the mushroom cloud. And I think, you know, it's not there everywhere in all these projects, but to the extent that Saarinen, like even the late Alto, like the late Corbusier, like Kahn, is associated with a kind of post-war humanism, it's sometimes called, a kind of softening of the sharp edges of modern architecture, a kind of restoration of meaning, you know, a return of a kind of soul. Then you know, this needs to be confronted head on.
Yeah.
Mr. Saarinen certainly was very fortunate to have a father who was a great architect. And, you know, not from an intellectual point of view, but simply having a dad who might have been able to center him and, you know, position him within the discourse of architecture at a certain point in time. He was also certainly very fortunate to be an architect in the 1950s when corporations were seeking to build architecture, you know, maybe when, you know, they aspired to do something, you know, not just make usable space. They were seeking to do things that weren't simply commodities. And, you know, there was also this discussion about him being a part of the zeitgeist. And I'm just curious as to how much was he and his work shaped by the forces of his times, and then how much was, you know, he was an extraordinarily creative individual, a creative person. I see him very much as, you know, like many other non-intellectual, non-theoretical architects today in America, just very creative people, just building lots of cool stuff.
Can you name some names? Okay.
Just
tell me.
But, you know, to what degree do you think that he was pushing, or he was formed by his environment and his time?
Looking at me, I'm what? Now look, I was serious about the naming names because I think it's sort of an interesting kind of thematic, you know, for the panel to think what it means to talk about this today. And since you identify this as a persistent symptom in a way, this problem of the architect's relationship to their, you know, their sort of cultural and social environment, particularly if they don't make claims, if they don't write or speak, you know, systematically about that. I think that it doesn't matter that much what the answer is about this particular architect, I must say. I think what you're kind of identifying is very important and is a kind of interesting, it again poses problems for us in trying to understand it. Because we are trained in a sense to take into account the architect's intentions, whether they're articulated or whether, and, you know, you have a problem when the architect doesn't tell you what those are. But the act of not having intentions, and precisely, especially for someone who grew up with the kind of privileges that he did, this is, you know, they grew up in a kind of high bourgeois environment, and to, in a sense, emerge from that environment as an anti-intellectual. And this guy was kind of crazy. He was a little bit kind of, you know, like, I think you have to sort of acknowledge that there was something idiosyncratic, let's say, about this individual personality and the lists, you know, the little mirror writing, all kinds of things. And but definitely, I mean, not antagonistic to you know, universities, for example. He was actually some of his most eloquent theorizing is about the university. I think actually there's a nice article by Ellen Plattis in the you know, in the catalog about this, and it really is, he was very thoughtful about what is a university, and again it's curious because he doesn't actually seem to be the type, you know, so you know, it's more like, okay, what's the result? What's on the table as a result of this strange mixture is really what we need to take into account, not so much to kind of say, well, to generalize or ontologize, say architects are or are not functions or symptoms of their fathers, I don't know about the mothers, and, you know, their aunts and uncles, and then, you know, the environment, the times, the zeitgeist, etc. So, I mean, you know, sure, that represents a kind of strand of interpretive analysis, but it does seem to me that the net result of this sort of set of social and cultural formations and behaviors is sufficiently enigmatic in its own terms to sort of change the question. I guess that's what I'm kind of getting at, is that that's what I think is so interesting. It's always fascinating about this kind of figure who doesn't really fit.
But it's interesting also, I mean, the comparison to the father. I mean, here is the father who, you know, produced his significant work in Finland around the time of Finnish independence. I mean, there was a very clear project he was part of. I mean, there's no question about it, and there's a very uniform style. So here's the son that emerges in mid-century America. If you look at his clientele alone, I mean, it was clearly the who is who in American culture. There were universities, major companies, the American government. But if you look at the kind of diversity of the client body, and if you would ask them, what is the project that they share, it would be a very difficult. You know what I'm saying? So it's a very different kind of cultural, social milieu than the kind of Finnish turn of the century milieu, where there's a project, I mean, nationalist project, whatever you say, but there's a, so, you always say, like, what was Saarinen's kind of, what is the kind of driving thing that kind of unifies all the projects? It's very hard, yeah. There were so many forces also, yeah.
I didn't know the thing about my father doing his work at the time of the Finnish nationalization and independence, but
Well, we can, because there are actually other questions. Yeah.
okay.
I think Bob had.
So the father has.
I don't want to interrupt you. I think that two things occurred to me in this discussion that's taking place. By the way, thank you for all your very fine talks, and especially Marc did a wonderful job of reinterpreting, meta-interpretation of meta-interpretations. Excellent. Two things occurred to me about Saarinen, whom I did know, I'd met at least. I don't say I know him, I met him. But one thing is, there was a program, and was called the American Century, and Henry Luce mapped it out right before the Second World War, and people truly believed in it. And at the end of the war, all these architects who were beginning to work for the government in the embassies, it comes out in the catalog, and the corporations like General Motors and so forth, there was a program about America taking leadership in the world as it had never before, and showing the rest of the world what capitalism and democracy together can produce. So I think it's unfair to categorize as angry English, frustrated intellectuals and architects where the country wasn't coming together after the war, was losing power and position, took out against the Americans whom they resented deeply. And that's a complicated story, but England was declining and America was rising, Banham and others. The other thing about Saarinen that occurred to me for the first time, maybe it's very obvious, but I'd never thought about it, of all the major architects of his generation, the form givers, as Eva, he was the only one who wasn't indoctrinated at Harvard. He was not.
Somewhere else.
He wasn't ever indoctrinated. He wanted to be a sculptor. Let's remember that. He spent a year in Paris studying sculpture. Then he came back, and I guess he wasn't so good at it. He was good enough, but not as good as he thought he should be. Then he goes to Yale, which was not a doctrinaire place at that time or ever. And it comes to modernism, and he leads his father to stylistic modernism, but not through an educational process, through reading, seeing. And also he was extremely well-traveled. It's not true that he didn't travel. When he left Yale, he spent 2 years traveling, and we have evidence of what he saw. It's incredible drawings and stuff. So he was very well-traveled, and he traveled after the war. Eva knows that. We even have his travel slides, my God. He was hardly a provincial. And all the architects of his generation both hated him and loved him. They admired him enormously. They only hated him because he had the best commissions. And clients, whether they were university presidents or corporate presidents, adored talking to him. This man could not have been boring or without ideas. It's just because he didn't write them down. It's only, I would apologize, my generation, and now your generation, who's obsessively writing everything down, endlessly arguing. It's all our fault. I take responsibility as much as others. But architects in those days didn't write endless justifications for beach houses and whatever. So you can't judge Saarinen by today's standards, is what everybody is saying. And I just, we have to realize who he was and what he accomplished in his own extraordinary critical milieu. And the Mad Men folk really understand that. And that'll be tomorrow's, I'm sure, interesting session.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's true. And thank you for your for the contextualization, which I do think is important. But I think, in a way, that's what I was trying to sort of say in response to the previous question, that it's maybe better not to judge the person, even the work, than to try to understand what the implication of this, let's say it's the American century, right? You know, that would be a very interesting thing, I think, to, you know, put like on the table and discuss, not just how it sort of played out, but also what was at stake under the circumstances. And I do think that the crisis of conscience that you know, that he to some extent serviced or found a way to articulate in his kind of in his work, in his sort of softening of the modernist idiom, in his expressiveness, and probably in his jokes also, because I think he probably was a pretty engaging fellow. It belongs to that. It belongs to that, you know, project which may or may not have been written down. It certainly was. You're right. I mean, in other contexts, and I certainly wouldn't disparage him for not writing, because I frankly don't particularly enjoy reading most of what gets written down, and, you know, as apology. Ben is telling us to.
So we can take one more question. Or you wanted to say?
No, but yeah, we should.
We should let you say something. You know?
No, I was just going to, building off a little bit on that and Bob's comments as well. It's interesting in juxtaposition to the previous comments, there's this notion of the incredible privilege which actually Saarinen acknowledged, of being on the one hand born into this sort of highly erudite kind of context of the father and Cranbrook, etc., but also being kind of privileged to be practicing in this time of general affluence and culture, and to have access to these incredible kind of clients, both at kind of corporate, governmental, and institutional level. At the same time, there is this kind of interesting quality, and one of the things that I found most kind of fascinating about even some of the anecdotal stories about the office and how they pursued work was at the same time a kind of curious, let's say a kind of uneasy quality that I think is kind of fascinating, that there's this kind of continual sort of search and kind of research, and a kind of obsession with iteration, which I actually find is kind of part of the pathology of practice today in a certain way, which in a way is sort of contradictory to the image of Saarinen as kind of this sort of smooth operator who's kind of extending his influence into these various spheres and kind of taking advantage of this kind of productivity. So on the one hand, there's this kind of incredible, let's say, engagement with and a kind of latching onto the technologies, practices, and operations of the day. On the other hand, there's a certain, let's say, one could sort of begin to identify a kind of continual search, a kind of, I don't want to put it in negative terms, but almost a kind of a lack of knowing where one is going that emerges into a kind of experimentalism. So this sort of obsession within the office of multiplication of variations, of iterations upon iterations, is kind of fascinating to me in that regard. And I guess as an architect, as a designer, it's a kind of pathology that I can kind of relate to at a certain scale, that this sort of anxiety about sort of discerning what might be the kind of right response to a situation at some level gets kind of played out in this almost sort of neurotic kind of repetition, which I think is a kind of curious counterpart to the perceived kind of confidence of the era in a way, right? And maybe it kind of leads back to your sort of anxieties in the kind of post-war period, the kind of post-nuclear period.
Okay.
You were earlier saying that how Saarinen is difficult for architecture students to understand. At the same time, Eero Saarinen has been receiving a lot of attention within the field of historic preservation. Thing is that considering the fact that within the field of architecture and in design, criticism, critiques, and practices are constantly evolving and changing, how do you see that the next generation of of designers and scholars are going to see Saracen and his peers 20, 30 years from now?
That's them.
Because we're the ones who are going to be taking over your positions in the world. Because keep in mind, the students you teach now, we're the ones who are going to be taking over the firms and the positions of scholarship in the future. That's why you all do such a great job educating us.
Yes. I hope you're taking notes. Can we give a quick answer? No, you're right. You're definitely being prepared to take over the world. The preservation question, I think, that is a very interesting one. With this, I guess the very simple question that would have to be left open-ended is what exactly is being preserved. If what we just discussed was true, if there really is a kind of, let's say, cultural apparatus, a cultural project, a sort of, it's not just the bricks and mortar, as it were, but there are meanings, there are, intentional or not. Then it's one of the questions would be, how do those values, such as they are, translate into this context? It's not just the JetBlue kind of, updating. That seems to me the sort of relevant sort of way to think about this.
No, I mean, it's actually interesting because one of the things about the Saarinen buildings that some of them became kind of defunct already during the, very brief period. The TWA terminal, for example, the technology surpassed the terminal very soon. So there's this sort of accelerated mode. As we know, the St. Louis Arch also is kind of disconnected from the, it doesn't really work as a city park. So there are a lot of issues. The Bell Labs building was too big even for American Express to take over. So a lot of buildings. So then you have to get, decide, does this building has enough cultural value that no matter what, we'll try to somehow make it work. And I think that's an issue at many of these preservation cases. I know that there's a competition now for, maybe Marc, you are doing the St. Louis Arch competition, and it will be a huge challenge to make the park work for the city, not as an icon for the city, but actually as something that is used and by the citizens. So it's a tricky question. We saw kind of images, but so the truth, like the London embassy also, that stopped working for the client, and there was a huge discussion about whether that should be preserved. So it's not an easy question.
And just to kind of briefly build on that, I mean, there's on the one hand the physical preservation of the actual artifacts that we've been referring to. On the other hand, in terms of relevance, I mean, I do think that there's the notion of Saarinen's legacy relative to a whole series of issues that continue to kind of either plague us today or that we have kind of the opportunity to explore, depending upon how one looks at it. And so, I mean, I think it would be, as a student, kind of useful to consider his relationship to kind of technology, kind of experimentalism, and kind of techniques of materialization and fabrication, which are kind of obviously a kind of ongoing sort of obsession. There's the kind of relationship to kind of notions of kind of program and kind of Klein, and there's this curious way in which Saarinen is able to kind of operate within sort of very sort of let's say loaded and kind of charged circumstances, and to kind of produce architectures which on the one hand can be seen as expressions of these these sort of institutions and organizations, but on the other hand have this kind of idiosyncratic and kind of enigmatic quality that we're all kind of referring to, and that's part of the kind of fascination. So I think there's on the one hand the physical artifacts of the architecture, on the other hand there is beginning to kind of look kind of beyond that at the ways in which they begin to kind of reveal certain approaches to trajectories that are still sort of present today.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, this is